Hey everybody. I previously talked about the Iran Contra sort of connections and everything, but now to rewind, I would like to discuss the Bay of Pigs invasion because this is largely the beginning of what I can. So basically, from the Bay of Pigs invasion to Iran Contra was kind of like one major chapter of CIA history, and it's all linear, in my opinion, because a lot of the alumni of the Bay of Pigs who were in the CIA would pop up again during Iran Contra, and arguably some of the people involved in Iran Contra popped up again underneath Trump's first term, like Jeffrey Epstein, William Barr, people of that things of that nature, people of that sort of caliber, right? And it's all kind of an extension. Um, and I like I said this in my last video. I love the United States. You know, I'm patriotic. I serve my country. I am not affiliated with the CIA or anything. I'm just a guy who likes this type of history. It kind of keeps me entertained. Everything I'm finding is public information. Um, yeah, so it just is what it is. So if you're watching this or something, like I'm not trying to go against the United States or anything. I think that even though I'm kind of a left wing person, I still like the United States. I still want to defend the United States. I still believe in real politics. Um, so I kind of just like to study history just to kind of sharpen my worldview right now. Uh, so yeah, regardless. So the Bay of Pigs, right? So it kind of gets to the point. We know what that was, right? This is basically the United States trying to overthrow Castro, right? So at the time, the commander in chief, the president, was Eisenhower, and then Eisenhower eventually gave over the reins to Kennedy. But I want to say that the policy studies around eventually overthrowing Castro, who was at one point kind of considered to be a potential ally to the United States, or useful kind of puppet potentially. Essentially, by the time Kennedy took office, it was kind of clear that Castro was going to be a problem to the United States because of his coziness with getting up with the Soviets, right? So that's why I put Eisenhower and Kennedy, right? So late 50s, early 60s, right? So the CIA director at the time was Allen Dulles. Him and his brother, I think John Foster Dulles or something. But regardless, Allen Dulles, formerly of Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, kind of an elite corporate law firm doing a lot of like shadow stuff during World War II and beyond, or even before. He was a CIA director, right? Kind of a very your prototypical crusty blue blood East Coast Ivy League type person, right? Probably racist. I'm guarantee he probably was, etc. Right? His deputy director was a person named Charles P. Cable, who was a U.S. Air Force general, right? And what's interesting is that Cable is the brother to Earl Cable, who was the mayor of Dallas during the time JFK was assassinated. So, ding, 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 red flag right there. And then we got the chief of counterintelligence, who was James Jesus Angleton, who's essentially involved in spying of spies, coordination with other allied intelligence agencies, etc. Right? Underneath uh, the director, you have the director of plans, who was Richard Bissell, who was essentially the deputy. He was, I think, called a deputy director of plans. Um, Also head of Directorate of Operations, formerly Office of Policy Coordination. So, in other words, Director of Plans and Operations, right? So he's the guy who, you know, Alan Dulles has the vision. Um, it's Richard Bissell's jobs to execute that, basically, right? And he divides and further delegates his responsibility, right? And he does this through an assistant deputy director of plans, Tracy Barnes. Um, and I want to say underneath Tracy Barnes was let me see here. So it's very interesting, right? So underneath Tracy Barnes is the chief of the Western Hemisphere, J.C. King. J.C. King is like a West Point graduate. I think his like from a wealthy type family who I think had ties to, like, Latin American oil. In other words, a part of the class of capitalists who wanted their interests protected. And he eventually becomes involved with the CIA, eventually OSSCIA, right? But Tracy Barnes, I think, bypasses J.C. King, even though J.C. King, I believe, is one of the first people to actually suggest to assassinate Castro. But Tracy Barnes wants to essentially delegates what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion to the chief of Western Hemisphere Branch 4. So think about, so in other words, this chief of Branch 4 answers to J.C. King, but Tracy Barnes wants to work directly with the branch manager, effectively, right? Instead of the regional manager, he wants to work with the branch manager, right? Like a fast food restaurant, a franchise. And that person is Jacob Esterling, who is essentially a program manager for making what will become the Bay of Pigs happen, right? And like I said, this may not be 100% accurate. This is just the best way how I could just kind of describe it. So Jacob Esterling, as the program manager, right? He is overseeing the chief of paramilitary operations slash Western Hemisphere, who is Colonel Jack Hawkins of the United States Marine Corps, whose specialty is amphibious assault. And also underneath him, there's Grayson Lynch and Rip Robertson, who are also two other CIA sort of spooks. And Rip Robertson role is essentially to command the exiles of the invasion, right? So in other words, you had a lot of people who fled Cuba, and they want to get back at Castro. So Rip Robertson is kind of going to be the guy who's going to lead them into battle. Him and Grayson Lynch, right? But you also have, let me see here, um, saboteurs, paramilitary operating officers, and everything like Felix Rodriguez, who is essentially his goal was to infiltrate Cuba before the invasion, right? Sneak in, figure out things, yada yada, be a scout. And Felix Rodriguez would pop up many times in Cold War lore, from I think the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena, I believe it was his name. Also, Felix Rodriguez also allegedly led the unit who hunted down Che Guevara. So like Felix Rodriguez was the son of wealthy Cuban plantation owners, I believe. So he was kind of the kind of right wing capitalist, sort of colonial sort of ideology himself, and he eventually ends up joining, U.S. military, CIA, etc., and essentially becomes kind of involved in even assassination campaigns, arguably. And the Cubans are going to be one of the major people, groups of people that it seems the CIA taps into in order to carry out kind of hits on people, right? And the Cubans, of course, have many ties to drug trafficking, particularly in the South Florida, Miami region. Um, so underneath Esterline, you had essentially the chief of paramilitary operations. Basically, these are the guys you're going to make sure like they're trained and the invasion force is ready, right? To the side here, I had in orange, I have finance. So you have Paul Helliwell, and Paul Helliwell was essentially the banker of the CIA. He was the guy who would set up, banks and move money around, like Castle Bank. He helped set up what would eventually become like Civil Air, whatever, which would become Air America, etc. Right? So you have the finance, you have operations, plans, policies, etc. Right? So we go from kind of like vision to policy to strategy to operations to tactics to sustainment and support, right? And we got finance with to make sure the money goes where it needs to be. But then interesting, right? So back into the actual operations and tactics side, right, with Rip Robertson. Rip Robertson, interestingly, a couple years later, would find himself in the Congo during the whole Patrice Lumumba overthrow, I believe, in which the Congo, the station chief there was a person named Larry Devlin. Um, and it's interesting that Rip Robertson, some of these Cubans that he became familiar with, he recruited them to go over to the Congo. And one of those Cubans, I think his name was Ricardo Monkey Morales, like admitted to like killing like hundreds of people over there or something. Like, because Congo was kind of like this big battle zone between the West and the Soviets. Um, and you had the Cubans also over there as well, trying to help out the communist cause. So it kind of is to your benefit to have Cubans who can infiltrate those potential Cuban left wing or communist networks or something. But also just the fact that the Cubans have already been trained in paramilitary operations to effectively be death squads over there. Um, or hit teams, etc. Right? Or also even to even help. I think they were helping to like protect shipments over Lake Tanganyika or something, and help like extract missionaries. So like it is all sorts of clandestine type stuff. But anyways, so the handler of the Cuban government in exile was another famous spook, E. Howard Hunt, who was I forget what CAO I meant was, like a civil actions officer or something like that, or what, civil affairs officer or something. But regardless, let me see here. I want to say that E. Howard Hunt actually knew Paul Helliwell, and most likely knew John K. Singlaub and other sort of World War II OSS spooks, because of their involvement in Southeast Asia via Detachment 202, which was actually spoken about by the YouTube content creator Eyes Wide Open. So I'll give him credit for that whole connection with the Unit 202, because I never knew that before seeing some of his videos. But E. Howard Hunt was kind of like, you could think of him as like a recruiter, but then also kind of like riling up the Cuban community in exile, who were not just in South Florida like Miami, but also in Tampa. And Tampa had a big mob presence with the Trafficante crime family. But then you also had a very big Cuban presence, a lot of people don't know, in New Orleans, and Italian population in New Orleans. And so not only you have the Cubans there, you also have some Italian mafia connections down there as well. And the ports of not only in Florida but also in New Orleans were also major hubs for shipping arms, goods, drugs, etc. Right? And you also got to think that a lot of pilots, like I think it's like David Ferry, and others attached to Civil Air Patrol, which is kind of like an auxiliary to the United States Air Force. Um, and people like Barry Seal, who's also from Louisiana, flying goods to Cuba isn't that hard to do from a place like New Orleans or Miami, right? So there's a lot of connections between New Orleans, Tampa, South Florida, Cuba, and the larger Central Latin America as a whole. So E. Howard Hunt, who's also, interestingly, where do we know him from? We know him from the Watergate scandal. And some people think that like the Watergate scandal was actually like a way to set up Nixon, because Nixon potentially was going to like blow the lid on everything and declassify everything that happened with the earlier Bay of Pigs invasion, and the CIA didn't want that, but they exploited Nixon's paranoia and essentially like pitched the idea that people like Frank Sturgis and or E. Howard Hunt or these other spooks of the CIA could basically break into the Democrats' headquarters, get caught, get exonerated after getting caught, but it would tarnish Nixon's reputation, causing him to eventually be impeached, or rather step down before being impeached, right? So it's very interesting. So you got to think about this, right? If that's true, if that theory is true, and let's just say that let's say that the CIA was involved in JFK, not only can they take out a president, they can also impeach a president too. Like it's just this is when you start seeing arguably the CIA kind of get out of control. Ultimately, at the end of the day, from after World War II up to the Iran Contra scandals. Um, but anyways, right? So you have the handlers of the Cubans in exile, but then I also highlight you have psyops, so psychological operations, which were performed by David Atlee Phillips, and then underneath that, so not only is E. Howard Hunt helping to handle the Cuban government exile in the United States, he's working with a person named Gerard Droller, who is kind of like personnel management of the Cuban exiles. So think about actually like really manpower, right? So kind of like E. Howard Hunt is kind of like the liaison, the aide de camp for the Cubans in exile and everything like that. Whereas Gerard Droller is kind of like the personnel management. Actually, this is your number, this is your roster, this is your gun, this is making sure they get to the right place at the right time, their training is intact, etc. Right? So and then so in this box over here, recruiter of exiles into Brigade 2506, right? So a lot of these Cuban exiles end up joining this brigade called Brigade 2506, who are essentially the base of the actual manpower for the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, many of Brigade 2506 splintered into other anti-communist Cuban groups, many involved in terrorism, like Alpha 66, Cuban Power, Operation 40. I think Operation 40 and Bay of Pigs are more in tandem with each other, but Operation Mongoose after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, in which this is when you start hearing all the kooky ways they tried to kill Castro because invasion didn't work, like poisoning his cigars or blowing up conch shells and getting his mistresses to off him while he sleeps, etc. Right? And let me see here. And some of those Cubans end up joining Five Command or working alongside something called Five Commando in Congo, which I want to say is a mercenary group who essentially went down to Congo to be like kind of war profiteers. But the CIA was kind of involved with that whole operation as well under Rip Robinson and Larry Devlin. Um, and then underneath here, so let's go to the left, so to switch it up a little bit. I have something called training cadre. So this is essentially kind of like the tech school, right? So if you've ever been in the military, they send you to tech school after basic training. So like the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Air National Guard, helped in the training of the Cuban exiles, and they helped train them at Usepa Island, Florida, in New Orleans in the bayous, Panama, uh, Fort Benning, Georgia, and Fort Knox, which is very important. Probably if like your, let's just say your sergeant, staff level officers at like the School of Americas, you can. This is where they kind of teach foreign people how to basically lead armies that are up to the standards that the United States wants. Um, New Orleans, Bella Chase, Puerto Rico. So you had a lot of, I think they were also in Guatemala as well. I mean, it kind of goes on. So you had basically refugees from Cuba, essentially being, expertly recruited into a kind of a legit paramilitary organization, even though it failed, right? So like I said, we have the president at the top who has the vision. And then, the director comes up with a strategy to fulfill that vision, right? It's like a mission, vision statement, the strategy. Then you start getting into the operations with Richard Bissell. And Richard Bissell's interesting is because Richard Bissell is known for actually being the link between the La Cosa Nostra mafia and the CIA by way of Howard Hughes's kind of secret, kind of spook, I think Robert Mayhew, I believe was his name, or something of that nature. But anyways, a Howard Hughes private security person with mob ties connected Richard Bissell of the CIA with the mob, particularly of the Chicago outfit, and the New Orleans and Florida-based outfits. Then you start getting in from operations into tactics. Then you have sustainment and support with kind of finance, psychological operations, like, kind of releasing pamphlets, radio stations, like Radio Swan, which was a CIA backed news station, radio station on an island in the Caribbean, kind of broadcasting just American propaganda into Cuba. Um, Let me see here. Okay, right. So so you also have coordination centers, right? And the CIA uses something called cryptographs, right? So they're essentially just name new alpha, how can I say it? Phonetic letter combinations, basically. Um, and one of them is JM Wave, which is essentially was the Miami-based coordination center. You had JM Move and JM Tracks in New Orleans and in Guatemala, which were code names for the training and logistics centers. And then you had something called JM or JMate, which is air support. And it's very interesting is that I think, as legend goes, is that when Kennedy got word that the Bay of Pigs invasion was basically being slaughtered, it wasn't working according to plan. He didn't call in air support, right? Because that would have been too much of direct action of the military against Cuba, and they wanted this to be more of a clandestine operation. And some people suspect that John F. Kennedy's inability to call in air support, like some of the top brass at the Pentagon wanted, is one of the reasons why Kennedy kind of lost the military establishment. And some even take it even further of this is why he got assassinated, even though it seemed like JFK had a lot of different enemies, from personal lovers and quarrels for all the people he slept with, and well, marriages he probably ruined. Some of those people were involved in the CIA, like Cord Meyer. Cord Meyer was the chief propagandist at the CIA, who was like a world federalist. Um, and his wife actually had an affair with JFK. So kind of you're sleeping with the CIA's with wives of CIA officers, right? Who know very dangerous people. Um, the mafia, because of his brother clamping down on all their corruption. It just goes on and on, and just people who generally just thought that he was too soft on communism. A lot of people dislike JFK, where it's almost impossible to kind of 100% figure out who exactly took him out. All you can really do is kind of look in a direction and just know that it's in that direction, but you can't necessarily pinpoint one culprit. And it's almost like they set up the JFK assassination to be confusing on purpose. Like, allegedly some of these Cubans admitted to being in Dallas the day of JFK's assassination, but let's just say that like they weren't involved. Like if you're gonna plan something like that, it's like you want as much chaos as possible, and you want as much plausible deniability and tangents as possible, right? So you invite these Cubans, they're just sitting in a hotel smoking cigarettes, going to strip clubs, thinking that they're gonna get a call to do something cool, but they don't actually do anything. but the fact that they're there incriminates them into possibly being suspects. And then you can say the same thing about mafiosos. You can say the same thing about kind of like weird, arguably sex trafficking pedophiles and stuff like that in the Dallas metro area who had ties likely to the New Orleans scene and everything like that. Um, that was being investigated with a lot of the New Orleans connections. And child abuse was very prominent in New Orleans, particularly with like there's like a Boy Scout troop like 187 or 178 or something like that, in which like investigators actually said that one of the people involved in the child abuse was maybe have been like a CIA person because of all the different outfits that they had. And people like David Ferry, who was actually involved and knew Lee Harvey Oswald, who was involved in a Civil Air Patrol, um, was, actually lost his job for messing with young boys when he was aspiring to be like a Jesuit priest. So there's a lot of kind of weird stuff even going on there that kind of leads you down another darker rabbit hole. And I even think that it even connects even to, if you go down that dark rabbit hole of like the child abuse element and everything and the pedophile type elements as well, is that Jack Ruby, during when he was kind of just going off his rocker, kind of around the time of the JFK assassination, ends up staying in a halfway house for whatever reason, and he signs a statement or like a check basically, or like a receipt from a person named what's his name? Let me go here real quick. See something. Go back to my notes. No. Here we go. John David Norman. John David Norman was one of probably the worst pedophiles ever in the United States, who largely built like the pre-internet infrastructure for like, you know, exploitative content of minors, to put it in a very technical term, because I don't want to say the actual term. Um, if Jack Ruby actually signed something from that guy who actually had ties to Dallas himself, that's another can of worms, because John David Norman was spoken about in documentaries like such as The Clown and the Candyman, which actually speculates that serial killer Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman of Houston, actually was involved in a human trafficking ring and giving exploitative content of minors to a syndicate in Dallas. In Dallas. And it's argued, and a lot of people believe that that syndicate was being ran by John David Norman. John David Norman, when he gets busted in his Dallas apartment, they found a Rolodex of cards, like thousands of names of pedophiles across the globe in the United States. Those cards end up going missing, I believe, which is a common theme in a lot of these weird cases, right? Which I've talked about in my other video about John David Norman and his ties to serial killers. And John David Norman, when he skips town, he flees Dallas, goes to Illinois, then he ends up actually becoming he ends up entering the orbit of John Wayne Gacy via his accomplice Phil Paskey. And Phil Paskey actually worked for PDM Contractors, the contractor that John Wayne Gacy, the contracting business that John Wayne Gacy owned. So see how crazy that sounds? Like if that signature that Jack Ruby, who was actually most likely gay himself, I believe he had like a lover, and I think he also has some real deep psychological issues or whatnot. Some even say that he was actually even potentially uh, overdosed with LSD during therapy sessions, in which I want to say the actual chemist who drugged him had ties to New Orleans. Something kind of weird in and of itself. But regardless, if that's true, that Jack Ruby signed a receipt from the same John D. Norman that we think that Norman is, then that's just a whole nother can of worms that kind of even more goes into the darker side of humanity. Because we're not just talking about regime change, drug smuggling, gun running, but now you're also getting into human trafficking and the exploitation of minors. And unfortunately, these things exist. And intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies know they exist, but it's almost like they don't necessarily enable them, but they infiltrate them to understand them. But in certain cases, by them not acting, they are enabling them to a certain extent. Because not only did the Rolodex cards of John David Norman in Dallas go missing, I want to say his additional set of Rolodex cards when he was in Illinois went missing. And a person from the State Department came, took the index cards, and lost the index cards of the names of the acquirers of these kind of boy love organizations. So it goes pretty deep and it gets kind of crazy, you know, if you really take it to that level. But I just wanted to kind of talk about Bay of Pigs invasion and kind of how that kind of works. And I think the next thing I'm going to do is talk about the Blonde Ghost Network, which I kind of talked about in my previous video, but I'm going to go there. But essentially, the reason why I talked about the Bay of Pigs is because this is like the first node. Basically, you can't understand anything else without understanding the Bay of Pigs, because many of the veterans of the Bay of Pigs went off to have very illustrious or crazy careers after the fact. So that's why I talked about Bay of Pigs and how the Bay of Pigs CIA was basically no different than the Iran Contra CIA, because they were all just alumni. You know, they started off as younger. They started off as kind of like younger, um, employees. But then by the time the 80s come, these guys are seniors ups. I mean, they're running their own stations. They're station chiefs now. You know, so they have tenure. So I think I'm just gonna end it right there. If I might do another video where I kind of read about some of the names of some of the people on here. But before I end this, actually, let me do something real quick for you. All right, so I just want to show you this real quick. So this is from one of my older videos about kind of like the connections between serial killers and pedophiles, and how I talked about how John David Norman allegedly signed a receipt for Jack Ruby at a 2235 Ewing Street in Dallas, right? That's why I put JFK here, right? So John David Norman was kind of like in the middle of like a lot of crazy pedophile rings, serial killers, etc., right? One of those cases was Boy Scout Troop 137 in the Adelphi Academy. And interesting, in that case that lasted from 1974 to 1977, so you end up having a person named Raymond Woodall and a person named Louis Sal, who pleaded guilty in 1976. Louis Sal knew District Attorney Henry Connick Sr., the father of Henry Connick Jr., the singer. And Henry Connick Sr., who was known for kind of being a corrupt DA, allegedly destroyed the files by Jim Garrison, who was investigating the New Orleans connections to the JFK assassination. And Jim Garrison is actually known for um, bringing up the name Clay Shaw, who was actually later revealed by Richard Helms, the CIA director, to be a member of the Domestic Contact Service in 1974. But Clay Shaw died in 1974, I think. So Clay Shaw, who was a gay man who was involved in the gay communities of New Orleans or whatnot, um, likely knew David Ferrie. David Ferrie, Lee Harvey Oswald, Civil Air Patrol. Also, most likely, Barry Seal, who was also in Civil Air Patrol, kind of around the same age as Lee Harvey Oswald himself. There's the famous photo of Barry Seal, um, allegedly with members of Operation 40, which dealt with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Um, it goes on and on. But also in this case, there was a person named Robert Lang, and nobody knows who he is. But according to police, they found photos of him, and he was wearing like uniforms of like four different military branches at like crazy ranks of like colonels and generals. So they suspected that he had to be some sort of spook or connected to some sort of intelligence agency. And I'm not saying that the CIA is like implicit or causing, child trafficking. However, you got to realize that this was, especially in the early CIA like this, it was the Wild West. Like it was kind of who you knew more so than background checks and all these type of things, right? How we have them probably today. So maybe a couple, let's just be real, pedophiles slipped into the CIA. Think about it. They get to travel the world to places where there's no child protections. You know what I'm saying? Like they're very sneaky in of themselves and gross, and they can probably shack up with other pedophile networks and infiltrate other countries' pedophile networks, which therefore touches upon other segments of the black market, from drugs, gun runnings, contract killings, etc. So what makes us think that either A, Robert Lang possibly could have been this David Berry guy who had a track record of trying to solicit young boys, or it could be some other CIA person who was a pedophile in the CIA who used the CIA training and networks to kind of get out of Dodge and get out of trouble, potentially. So who knows? But that's why I put the JFK connection this larger into this larger CIA connection stuff, right? And I mean, it's pretty wild, like pretty nuts. John David Norman, John Wayne Gacy, another Illinois serial killer, Brian Dugan, alleges he was assaulted by Gacy. PDM contractors also hired a crew of serial killers called the Ripper Crew, led by Robin Getch. So you have, by John Wayne Gacy alone, at least not only a crew of serial killers, but one. And John Wayne Gacy always said that he didn't do all those murders, right? So it gets kind of crazy, like just the amount of deeper underbelly of society connections, right? It's wild. It's like drugs, child trafficking, gun running, etc. all kind of interlap. Then you have the North Fox Island connections, a lot of that stuff to it. It goes on and on and on. Reverend Bud Vermeil, Boys Farm in Tennessee, connections to um, the North Fox Island scandal. And arguably, I would not be surprised if the Atlanta child murders of 1979, 1981 were also very involved. Which is crazy, because that case really got Ronald Reagan's attention, like, and George Bush's attention, like, because it seemed like, I don't know. I mean, it was a major case that was really putting a black eye on the administration, but there's not many links to these other larger networks, but I would not be surprised if like the Wayne Williams Atlanta child murders also related to the Boy Scout Troop 137 in Louisiana, Boys Farm in Tennessee, North Fox Island in Michigan, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and then also culminating with like John Wayne Gacy, who's like a serial killer and pedophile, and then also John Norman. Then you go to Dallas with Dean Corll, Roy Ames, the Boy Scouts of America. I mean, it gets pretty dark pretty quick. So more to come even on that stuff. So I'm just gonna end this video right here. All right, thank you. All right, bye.